first grade, she started taking the bus. And it was the first time she ever took the bus. So if you know as a parent, you walk them to the bus stop. It's very fun. And so we got her on the bus. She went to school. At the end of the school day, someone from the school called my cell phone. They have my wife's cell phone. They have my cell phone. They called my cell phone. And she said, hey, do you know what bus number your daughter's supposed to be on? And I said, I'm her dad. As in, are you crazy? Like, I was like, this is how you thought you would get this information, was to call the dad? You saw a mom and dad's cell phone. You go, I bet the dad knows. I was like, do you have parents? Have you ever seen a family before? You thought let's call the husband? Unless there's two husbands, you should never call a husband a day in your life. I would rather you ask a lady that doesn't know her. I think she could get to the bottom of it quicker than I can. I had to go get her. I go, all right, I'll come get her. Tell me the name of this school and I'll come get her.
Good morning. It's Saturday, Rules Saturday, January the 24th, and this is The True Conservative. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Serenity Prayer and the patriotic song of the day, we will have no free lunch, motivation, meditation, and the Cold War. All that and more when I get back. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I should not change, the courage to change the things I should, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen. Thank you. Now, there's no free lunch. 250 Economic Truths by David Bahnsen.
The existence of big government and progressive income taxes guarantees non-neutrality. With steeply progressive tax rates, inflation pushes taxpayers into higher and higher tax brackets, even at unchanged real incomes. Taxes have to be paid on interest receipts, even though the bulk of the high interest rates represent inflation premiums. Soaring tax revenues, coupled with government's high marginal propensity to spend, led to an increasing share of government in the economy. Robert A. Mundell. I suppose in a twisted way, one of the advantages of a steeper progression in tax rates was the audacity it highlighted in how inflation caused higher tax burdens without higher real incomes. At flatter but not flat tax rates, taxpayers are still exposed to the perversion of what Mundell describes here, yet with a subtlety and slowness to it that stems off needed outrage. Inflation and progressive tax rates, the policy prescription of the 1970s, are the worst combination of economic circumstances possible. Sound money and lower marginal rates drive prosperity.
And that was There's No Free Lunch by David Bahnsen. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now, rules for retrogrades.
Rule 23. The memory of the Western public is exceedingly short, pathetically undisciplined, and never to be feared. Mod cons have been deeply conditioned to dread future political reprisals anytime they dare to contemplate substantial political action that threatens to drag the culture rightwards. So fearful are the mod cons, especially those empty suits holding elective office in legislative bodies, of potential backlash at the ballot box in the event that they act too decisively in bringing to fruition a conservative policy, that they succumb to what's fairly characterized as political paralysis. The reason for this phenomenon is simple. When weighty conservative policy initiatives, the ones that radicals really fear, are being floated and debated, a uniformly hostile and unapologetically perfidious media springs into action. Focus groups filled with disgruntled constituents are spotlighted, rigged polls are conducted, fringe demonstrations are televised, and the airwaves are flooded with talking heads shouting vitriol. The punditry begins a seemingly endless series of broadcasts dedicated to underscoring an alleged wave of populist grassroots resistance welling up in response to the conservative initiative. It is made to seem as if the mod con and his legislative compatriots are entirely isolated in the ideological sea, as if the public mood is such that voters can think of nothing other than the next election, wherein they can race to the ballot box and gift the mod con's job to his political rival. Don't be fooled. In spite of the chest-puffing and manipulative antics of a disgustingly biased media, the ballot box retribution that we're told is looming right around the corner is nothing but a specter, a chimera, devised by radicals to stymie retrograde progress by stealing the already scant courage of our wishy-washy representatives. The Western public is anything but a disciplined, principled, intellectual voting bloc. The average voter is embarrassingly ignorant about current affairs, and his political memory is slightly shorter than the average news cycle and slightly longer than a goldfish's. Some alarming poll numbers bear out this sad state of affairs. It turns out that only 36% of Americans are able to identify all three branches of government. In fact, 35% can't name any of them. A whopping 60% of Americans are unable to name the political party that controls the House of Representatives and the Senate. In the run-up to the last presidential election, more than 40% of Americans could not name the Republican or Democrat vice presidential candidate. 12% of Americans don't even know who the current vice president is. Clearly, A nation of political wonks we are not. Data paints a similarly dismal picture of the public's ability to harbor stable, cogent political sentiments over any significant periods of time. Consider this. Around the time of the passage of the Affordable Care Act, i.e. Obamacare, 59% of Americans opposed the law. Many did so vehemently, in contrast with just 39% who favored it. So unpopular was the bill that in the aftermath of its being codified into law by the Democrats along a straight party line vote, Republicans gained, in the 2010 midterm elections, a staggering 63 seats in the House of Representatives, putting them back in the congressional majority, and 6 seats in the Senate, including 1 seat in Massachusetts, which they had not won since 1972. Mind you, the eponymously dubbed Obamacare was the signature legislative achievement of Barack Obama's first presidential term, and in retrospect, perhaps the crown jewel of his entire presidency. Yet, despite the legitimate, non-fabricated grassroots public disdain for Obamacare circa 2010, and the unbridled popular animosity for its authors, just 2 years later, in the 2012 presidential election, Obama spanked Mitt Romney, earning 51.1% of the popular vote and 332 electoral college votes, in contradistinction to Romney's 47.2% and 206 electoral college votes. Public sentiment shifts with regard to the war in Iraq also testify to the fickleness and forgetfulness of the American voter. In March of 2003, still reeling from the 9/11 terror attacks, an overwhelming majority, 72%, of the American public favored the invasion of Iraq. Only a few years later, that number had dropped off drastically, with 61% of Americans actively disapproving of the war. Seeing as how the circumstances surrounding the beginning of the war had remained in relative stasis in the intervening years, it's difficult to explicate such an abrupt about-face except by recourse to voter attention deficit disorder. Then there's the infamous case of Anthony Weiner, or as many affectionately call him, Carlos Danger. Weiner served in the House of Representatives from 1999 to 2011, till it came to light that he, then married, had sent lewd photographs of himself to a female college student. As a result of the scandal, and in the face of a congressional ethics investigation, Weiner was forced to resign from the House of Representatives. Not one to be deterred from the siren song of a cushy political career, a short time later, in May 2013, Weiner announced his candidacy for mayor of New York City, a political gambit that the New York Post unforgettably captioned, Weiner's Second Coming. By late June 2013, the freshly disgraced former congressman, whose crotch shot had recently broken the internet, had surged to front-runner status in the mayoral race by a comfortable margin of 5 percentage points. If it were not for the fact that new allegations of Weiner's sexting with additional women surfaced shortly thereafter, he might have actually, in Phoenix-like fashion, rejuvenated his political career with a tenure in Gracie Mansion. The point of the foregoing anecdotes is to drive home one theme. Voters have tragically short memories which would rival those of clinical amnesiacs. How constituents will react to news of an elected official's advocacy for a particular issue or involvement with a given initiative should be the last thing perturbing the mind of said official. Members of the Western public are detached to a fault from the political cosmos. They're irresponsibly indifferent, preferring to indulge in fatuous smut television like Game of Thrones and The Masked Singer, rather than to pay adequate attention to their most basic civic responsibilities. It's nothing short of madness to imagine that the same folks who can't identify the current majority party in the United States Senate or name the Secretary of State will be intently following their elected officials' stances on nuanced policy controversies 1.5 years out from the nearest midterm election in hopes of ferreting out points of disagreement. As it is now, elected officials can essentially engage in any political errand, even to the point of scandal, with impunity, so long as they make nice and tickle the ears of their constituents with splendid promises of government candy in the 2 months leading up to an election. Given the advanced state of decay in the West, it's a laughable proposition that voters are going to hold elected officials accountable for any articulable reason, much less for a perfectly defensible, if perhaps unorthodox, position. Nevertheless, in the realm of American politics, the Republican Party consistently allows radicals to hinder the pace of its legislative agenda by heeding media attack dogs' manufactured warnings of impending ballot box apocalypse, blue waves, and such, if Republicans move forward in implementing conservative policies. Even in the aftermath of Donald Trump's election, when Republicans controlled the executive, legislative, and judicial branches of the federal government, the Republican sellouts failed to make good on any of their major legislative promises. They didn't defund Planned Parenthood. They didn't repeal or replace Obamacare. They didn't staunch the flow of illegal aliens pouring into our country. And the primary reason for their failure to act and secure these victories was fear of voter retribution, fear of losing their power and majorities. Due to their baseless fear, cowardly Republicans squandered this generation's best chance at making significant strides toward a more just and conservative America. The bitter irony is this: despite 2 years' worth of legislative impotence from Republicans, from 2016 to 2018, they still lost the House of Representatives in the 2018 midterm elections. The message is clear. To any retrograde political actors, forge ahead in your endeavors. Do not fear the phantom menace of voter backlash 2 years out. It's a sheer invention of a media class that is trying to interdict your progress. The archetypical tempest in a teapot. Put first things first and second things second, and you'll get both.
And so that's Rules for Retrogrades, 40 Tactics to Defeat the Radical Left by Timothy J. and David R. Gordon. And two things. Number one, the for-profit news media, and number two, Republican greed. So he basically says it's you and I, the voters, that are at fault here, and I reject that outright because I know what I see on television, what I read in the newspapers, etc., and here on the radio, and it is for-profit garbage. The reason that if I am a low-information voter or perhaps a single-issue voter, that's the reason, because I get no information, no relevant information from the for-profit news media. If I don't know who the vice presidential candidates are, it's because the for-profit news media refuses to tell me. If I don't know what issues are relevant, same thing. Non-profit news now. Second, Republican greed. Republicans are scared all the time because they're more interested in skimming the stock market than they are in representing their constituents. So they're very, very, very conservative. They're conservative to the point of absurdity. So once we get the loophole closed and we get voters used to demanding those kinds of answers from office holders and would-be office holders, such as if you have an office holder, for instance, don't hesitate to ask them, what was your net worth before you entered Congress? What's your net worth now? And are you skimming the stock market? Once we start holding these SOBs to account, and hopefully we can get the law fixed so that there is no more congressional loophole, then things will be better on that count, and Republicans will be ready to take reasonable risks. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, a little bit of motivation.
However small or insignificant each step may seem, you take it, you make it happen.
The way in which you make massive progress is learning the art of becoming single-minded, learning how to concentrate, learning how to focus in. And you'll be surprised at the things that you're able to do when you learn how to block things out, when you learn how to keep thine eyes single.
Clarity is power. If you know exactly what it is you really want, what you desire, what you're really after, the more clear you are on specifically what you want, the faster your brain can get you there. Your brain's like a servo mechanism in a missile. It locks on the heat signature. What does it do? It moves and follows it. That's the way your brain is if it knows the outcome, if it knows the result. I need to know the result and the after before I ever ask myself what to do. Stay focused on the target. The target is not the activity. The activity can change. It's what's the result I'm after. If you just keep looking at those outcomes every day, how am I doing on that outcome? Your brain will come up with ways to get to that outcome. I promise you. Focus on outcomes, not on activities.
You'll be surprised at the ideas that will come to you, of the opportunities that you'll be able to see. You'll begin to see things that have been staring there, looking you in the face, saying, I can't believe this has been here all this time.
If you're creative enough, can you find the answer, yes or no? If you're determined enough, can you find the breakthrough, yes or no? If you're passionate, loving enough, can you get someone to help you, yes or no? If there's no way that you're committed, can you find the money, even if you don't have it, yes or no? Creativity, decisiveness, passion, these are the ultimate human resources. And when you engage these resources, you can get any other resource on earth. And if you don't have what you want, stop telling yourself the story because you don't have the money or the time. That's bullshit. It's because you haven't committed yourself where you would burn your boats. If you want to take the fucking island, burn your fucking boats, and you will take the island because people, when they're going to either die or succeed, tend to succeed.
And you've got to be so relentless, regardless of what comes down the pike, that you're always looking for a way to get over, always looking for a way that you can break through, always looking for a way that you can win, always looking for a way that you can strike a telling blow.
Wherever focus goes, energy flows.
And that was a little bit of motivation. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now, a little bit of meditation. And that was a little bit of meditation. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, the Cold War.
Moscow, the Ministry of Defense, February 1991. The room is cold, smelling of stale tobacco and nervous sweat. It is deep winter in the Soviet Union, a season that mirrors the political frost creeping over the empire. But inside this windowless briefing room, the attention of the highest-ranking generals is not on the crumbling economy or the unrest in the Baltics. Their eyes are fixed on a series of grainy, urgent telexes arriving from Baghdad. For decades, the Soviet military doctrine was built on a single, unshakable pillar, mass. Thousands of tanks, protected by an impenetrable umbrella of surface-to-air missiles and radar-guided anti-aircraft guns. They believed that if NATO ever attacked, the sheer density of Soviet armor and air defense would grind the enemy into dust. They had exported this philosophy, and the hardware to back it up, to their client state, Iraq. The Iraqi military was the fourth largest in the world, a steel-plated fortress built on Soviet blueprints. It was supposed to be a meat grinder for the Americans, but the reports coming in from the Kuwaiti theater describe something impossible. It starts with a frantic transmission from an Iraqi Republican Guard commander stationed along the Saudi border. He is not reporting a high-altitude strike from invisible stealth bombers. He is not reporting a cruise missile barrage. He is screaming about a ghost. The transmission describes a column of T-72 tanks, the apex of Soviet export armor, being systematically dismantled. But the confusion lies in how they are dying. The Iraqi commander reports that his ZSU-234 Shilka units, radar-guided anti-aircraft tanks that pump out thousands of rounds per minute, are engaging a target at low altitude. By all laws of physics and ballistics, anything flying that low and that slow should be shredded instantly. The Shilka is designed specifically to turn low-flying aircraft into scrap metal. Yet the target does not fall. The report describes a dark, cross-shaped silhouette emerging from the smoke. It moves slowly, almost lethargically, ignoring the tracers arching toward it. It dives. A sound like tearing canvas erupts, a noise so loud it vibrates the hull of the command vehicle miles away. In seconds, a T-72 tank, a 40-ton beast of composite armor, erupts into a catastrophic fireball. The turret is tossed into the air like a toy. Then the silhouette turns. The Iraqi gunners pour fire into it. They see the round's impact. They see sparks fly off the fuselage. They see pieces of the wings shear off. The commander waits for the explosion, the inevitable crash that follows when a modern aircraft takes a direct hit from a 23mm cannon. But the machine does not crash. It rights itself. It climbs. And then, terrifyingly, it turns back around for another pass. In Moscow, the generals stare at the report. They check the translation. "It refused to die," the translator reads, his voice trembling. "We hit it. We saw it burn. But it kept flying. This is not supposed to happen. Modern aerial warfare is binary. You are either untouched or you are dead. Aircraft are fragile, filled with sensitive avionics and volatile fuel. A single golden BB, a stray bullet in the engine intake, brings down a $20 million jet. But this report speaks of an aircraft that treats anti-aircraft fire not as a death sentence, but as a nuisance. Another report comes in, this time from a different sector, a similar story. An Iraqi column pinned down, their heads kept low not by a supersonic fighter, but by a slow-moving predator that loiters over the battlefield for hours. The Iraqi soldiers are terrified. They call it the Whispering Death or simply the Cross. They claim they hit it with a shoulder-fired Igla missile, the Soviet answer to the Stinger, and the machine simply shrugged it off, trailing smoke but continuing to fire its cannon. Silence descends on the Moscow briefing room. Marshal Dmitry Yazov, the Minister of Defense, looks at the map of the Middle East. The Soviet Union has spent billions of rubles developing the MiG-29 aircraft and the Su-27 aircraft to counter American speed and agility. They spent decades perfecting the S-300 missile systems to shoot down high-flying bombers. They prepared for a war of speed, electronics, and altitude. They did not prepare for a brute. "What is it?" a general whispers. "Is it a new helicopter? A drone?" "No," an intelligence officer replies, sliding a grainy reconnaissance photo across the table. It shows a blurry shape, straight-winged, engines mounted high on the tail, looking more like a relic from the 1940s than a spaceship from the 1990s. It is the A-10. The Americans call it the Warthog. The generals scoff. They know the A-10. They have seen the specs in Jane's Defense Weekly. It is slow. It has no radar. It is ugly. It was scheduled to be retired by the US Air Force years ago because it was deemed too vulnerable for a modern battlefield. The Soviet assessment was clear. In a high-intensity conflict, the A-10 would have a life expectancy of minutes. It was a target, not a threat. So why are the T-72 tanks burning? Why are the elite Republican Guard troops abandoning their vehicles and fleeing into the desert at the mere sound of its engine? If you enjoy uncovering the lost secrets of Cold War history, make sure to subscribe to Cold War Impact and turn on notifications. We decode the declassified files that others ignore. The stakes for the Soviet Union could not be higher. This is not just a skirmish in the desert. It is a live-fire audit of their entire military philosophy. If a 40-year-old Soviet tank doctrine, supported by their best anti-air technology, cannot stop a subsonic, obsolete American aircraft, then the Red Army is a paper tiger. The panic in the room is palpable. They need to understand what is happening. Is the Iraqi crew incompetent? Or have the Americans invented a new type of armor? Or perhaps, is there something about the pilot? One specific intercept captures the imagination of the KGB analysts. It details a single aircraft, call sign Sandy, operating deep behind enemy lines during a search and rescue mission. The intercept describes the pilot flying explicitly into a kill box of concentrated anti-aircraft fire to protect a downed comrade. The amount of lead in the air is described as a wall of steel. No rational pilot would enter that airspace. It is suicide. But the pilot enters. The Soviet military attaches great value to bravery, but they view it through the lens of the collective, the sacrifice of the soldier for the motherland. This American pilot is displaying a different kind of bravery, an individual, almost insane recklessness. He is flying a slow plane into the teeth of the Soviet-made air defense network, taunting the gunners. He is mocking us, a general mutters, crushing a cigarette into an overflowing ashtray. He is mocking our guns. The mystery deepens. Reports confirm that this specific aircraft took critical damage. The hydraulics were shot out. The flight controls were severed. Half the tail was missing. By all rights, the laws of aerodynamics demand that the plane spins into the ground. The pilots of the MiG-23 aircraft or the MiG-25 aircraft would have ejected minutes ago, but the radar tracks show the Sandy flight is still airborne. It is limping back to base, flying on manual reversion, a mode of flight that requires brute physical strength to move the control surfaces via cables and cranks, like a truck without power steering. The Soviets are baffled. They are watching a technological impossibility unfold in real time. They need to know how this is possible. They need to know why their weapons, designed to kill sleek fighters, like the F-16 aircraft or the F-15 aircraft, are bouncing off this flying tank. The order goes out from Moscow to the KGB residence in Baghdad. Find out what that aircraft is made of. Find out why it does not die. And bring us the wreckage. This is the beginning of the mystery. The Soviets are about to embark on a desperate investigation into American engineering that will shatter their confidence and reveal a devastating truth about the gap between their military theory and the brutal reality of American air. Power. They are hunting for a secret technology, a magic shield. They do not yet realize that the secret isn't just in the metal, it is in a design philosophy they deemed obsolete 50 years ago. The Iraqi desert, Sector 4. 3 days after the ground war begins. The smoke has cleared, but the smell of burnt diesel and charred flesh hangs heavy in the air. A team of Soviet military advisors, disguised in nondescript fatigues, steps out of a UAZ 469 utility vehicle. They are here to conduct a post-mortem on a massacre. In front of them lies the twisted carcass of a T-72 tank. This machine was the pride of the Soviet export market. Its frontal armor was supposed to be impervious to standard NATO rounds. It was designed to fight across the plains of Germany, to shrug off hits from the Leopard 1 tank or the M60 tank. But the advisor, a grim-faced colonel from the GRU, stares at the turret in disbelief. It hasn't been blown off by a heavy, high-explosive missile. It hasn't been melted by a shaped charge. It looks like it has been attacked by a giant sewing machine. The steel plating is riddled with holes. Not small shrapnel marks, but clean, punch-through punctures the size of milk bottles. The colonel runs his gloved hand over the entry wound. It is smooth. Whatever hit this tank went through the composite armor, through the crew compartment, through the engine block, and exited out the rear, burying itself deep into the sand. Kinetic energy, the colonel mutters to his aide. No explosives, pure kinetic energy. He climbs onto the hull. He looks at the dispersion of the holes. They are grouped tightly, a pattern that suggests a weapon of terrifying accuracy and rate of fire. He calculates the angle. The attack came from above, but not from high altitude. A high-altitude strike would be a single laser-guided bomb. This was a strafing run. Who strafes a tank? The aide asks, bewildered. It is suicide. You have to fly straight and level. You make yourself a target for every gun on the ground. That is the central mystery that plagues the investigation. To achieve this kind of damage pattern, an aircraft has to fly low under 1,000 feet and slow. It has to point its nose directly at the tank for several seconds. In modern warfare, that is an eternity. That is enough time for a ZSU-234 Shilka to put 500 rounds into the cockpit. The advisors move to the next vehicle. It is a BMP-2 infantry fighting vehicle. It has been torn in half. The ammunition inside detonated, but the primary cause of death was the same. Massive, high-velocity slugs raining from the sky. They interview the survivors. The Iraqi soldiers are huddled in a bunker, eyes wide, morale shattered. They are battle-hardened troops who fought Iran for 8 years. They are used to artillery. They are used to gas. But they are broken by this. It sounds like a fart, one soldier says, staring at the ground. A loud electric buzz, brrr, and then everything explodes. Did you fire back? The Soviet colonel demands. Yes, we fired everything. The soldier shouts, his voice rising in hysteria. We hit it. I saw pieces fall off. I saw smoke, but it didn't care. It just turned around and killed the captain. The report that goes back to Moscow is filled with contradictions. The Soviet analysts are trying to fit this square peg into a round hole. Their entire understanding of air combat is based on speed and evasion. The MiG-25 aircraft flies at Mach 3 to outrun missiles. The Tu-22 bomber flies high to avoid flak. This American Ghost flies at 300 knots, slower than a World War II propeller plane in a dive, and absorbs punishment like a boxer. The investigation shifts to the technical capabilities of the enemy. The KGB Technical Directorate begins scouring their files on American close air support projects. They dig up old intelligence from the 1970s. They find references to a competition between two American companies, Northrop and Fairchild Republic. They find a project code named AX. It cannot be the AX, a senior analyst argues during a heated meeting in the Kremlin. That project produced the A-10. It is a subsonic brick. The Americans themselves hate it. The U.S. Air Force tried to cancel it 3 times. They want F-16 aircraft. They want fast jets. Why would they deploy a cancelled failure to the most important war in 20 years? It is a logical question. The Soviets knew that the U.S. Air Force hierarchy was dominated by the fighter mafia generals who loved speed, afterburners, and air-to-air combat. The A-10 was the ugly stepchild. It had no radar. It had no afterburners. It looked like a dragonfly with a glandular problem. The Soviets had dismissed it as a target drone. But the battlefield evidence tells a different story. The target drone is killing the Republican Guard. As the investigation deepens, the Soviets begin to build a legend around the aircraft, fueled by the paranoia of the unknown. They start to suspect that the Americans have developed a new type of material science. Titanium, the report suggests. They must have encased the entire aircraft in titanium armor. It is the only explanation for the survivability. They are partially right, but they miss the scale of the engineering audacity. They cannot conceive that the Americans would build a bathtub of titanium around the pilot, weighing over 1,000 pounds. To a Soviet aerospace engineer, weight is the enemy. You save weight to gain speed. Adding half a ton of armor to a plane is madness. It makes the plane heavy, sluggish, and fuel inefficient. They are sacrificing performance for survival, the analyst realizes. It is a philosophical shift, but the confusion peaks when they analyze the impossible return. On a Tuesday in the second week of the air campaign, Iraqi radar tracks an American aircraft taking a direct hit from a shoulder-fired SA-16 missile. The warhead packs a significant punch, designed to blow the wing off a fighter jet. The radar shows the American plane losing altitude. The speed drops. The radar signature blooms, indicating debris separation. Target destroyed. The Iraqi operator logs. But 2 minutes later, the target is still there. It is flying erratically, wobbling, but it is heading south, back to Saudi Arabia. The Soviets intercept the radio chatter. They expect to hear a pilot screaming, preparing to eject. Instead, they hear a calm, almost bored voice discussing hydraulic pressure. "I have lost PC-1 and PC-2, the pilot says. "Manual reversion is active." The Soviet translators freeze. Manual reversion? In the age of fly-by-wire systems, where computers make thousands of micro-adjustments per second to keep an unstable jet in the air, manual reversion is a concept from the history books. It means flying the plane with cables and pulleys, using sheer muscle power to move the heavy control surfaces against the slipstream. That is impossible, a Sukhoi Design Bureau consultant states flatly. If you lose hydraulics on a modern jet, you are a falling rock. You cannot fly a 10-ton jet with your biceps. They suspect it is a code. Manual reversion must be a code word for a backup electronic flight system, a secret computer brain that takes over. They cannot believe that the Americans have built a fail-safe so primitive, so mechanical, that it allows a pilot to wrestle a shattered plane home like a crippled tractor. The wrong conclusions pile up. The Soviets theorize that the A-10 pilots are on performance, enhancing stimulants to endure the stress. They theorize that the aircraft has a secret active protection system that shoots down missiles. It doesn't. They theorize that the engines have a magical heat suppression system because the heat-seeking missiles keep missing or locking onto the wrong part of the plane. They are overthinking it. They are looking for high-tech answers to a problem the Americans solved with low-tech genius. The paranoia reaches a fever pitch when the Highway of Death incident occurs. Thousands of retreating Iraqi vehicles are trapped on Highway 80. The A-10 aircraft descend like vultures. The carnage is so absolute, so total, that the Soviets watching the satellite imagery are horrified. This isn't war. It is industrial dismantling. The Soviet generals realize that their T-72 tanks, the iron fist of the Warsaw Pact, are obsolete not because they can't shoot, but because they are being hunted by a predator they cannot kill. They need to know the source of this power. They need to understand the weapon that is punching those holes. They have seen the plane, but they haven't seen the gun. The intelligence photos show a nose cone with 7 barrels, but the scale is hard to judge. "It looks like a Gatling gun," the report says. "But bigger." "How much bigger?" Moscow asks. "We don't know," the Baghdad resident replies. But the soldiers say that when it fires, the plane actually slows down. That claim is dismissed as battlefield myth. Physics dictates that recoil cannot significantly affect the forward momentum of a jet aircraft. It sounds like a tall tale, a ghost story told by terrified conscripts. But the Soviets are about to learn that the myth is real. They are about to discover that the Americans didn't build a plane and put a gun on it. They built a gun, a weapon of monstrous proportions, and wrapped a plane around it. The investigation is over. The evidence is undeniable. The Soviets have underestimated the A-10 Warthog because they judged it by the metrics of the jet age speed and altitude. They failed to measure it by the only metric that matters in the mud and blood of the battlefield, lethality. Now, we shift our gaze across the ocean. While the Soviets were scrambling to explain the ghost in the desert, we go inside the secret meetings in the 1970s, where a group of rebels within the Pentagon fought to build this ugly, indestructible beast. The Pentagon, Arlington, Virginia, 1970. While the Soviet generals in 1991 were chasing ghosts in the desert, the true origin of their nightmare began 2 decades earlier, in the fluorescent-lit hallways of the Pentagon. And ironically, the Soviet suspicion that this weapon was a secret project was half right. It was a project that the US Air Force establishment tried desperately to kill. To understand why the A-10 Warthog terrified the Soviets, you have to understand what it replaced. In the 1960s, the American philosophy of air war was identical to the Soviet one. Speed is life. The Air Force wanted sleek, supersonic jets like the F-4 Phantom. They believed that if a plane flew fast enough, Mach 2, Mach 3, it was invincible. But the jungles of Vietnam shattered that illusion. Pilots flying supersonic jets found themselves useless when trying to support troops on the ground. They were too fast to see the target. They would streak over the jungle at 600 knots, drop a bomb, and miss by a football field. When they slowed down to aim, their fragile, high-tech jets were shot full of holes by peasants with AK-47 rifles. A small group of rebels inside the Pentagon, known as the Fighter Mafia, looked at the data and realized a hard truth. The Air Force had forgotten how to fight dirty. They needed a street brawler, not a ballerina. They launched the AX program. The requirements they wrote were an insult to modern aerodynamics. They didn't ask for speed. They didn't ask for stealth. They asked for a plane that could loiter over the battlefield for hours, fly under the weather, and most importantly, survive a direct hit from the very weapons the Soviets were mass-producing. The result was the Fairchild Republic A-10 Thunderbolt II. And when the engineers at Fairchild sat down to design it, they didn't start with the wings or the cockpit. They started with the gun. The Soviet analysts in Part 2 were puzzled by the sewing machine holes in their tanks. They couldn't understand what kind of weapon could punch through top armor with such kinetic violence. The answer was the Gao 8 Avenger. This is not a machine gun. It is a piece of artillery. The GAU-8 is a 7-barrel, 30mm Gatling cannon. It is the size of a Volkswagen Beetle. It weighs 4,000 pounds fully loaded. The ammunition drum alone is the size of a cement mixer. The bullets are not lead. They are depleted uranium dense, heavy metal that sharpens as it penetrates armor, turning the interior of a tank into a spray of molten metal. The engineers faced a physics problem that would have made a Soviet designer quit. The recoil of the gun was so powerful, 10,000 pounds of force, that it roughly equaled the thrust of one of the plane's engines. If they mounted the gun off-center, the recoil would spin the plane out of the sky every time the pilot pulled the trigger. So, they made a radical decision. They placed the gun exactly in the center line of the aircraft. They built the fuselage around the cannon. They moved the nose landing gear off to the side to make room for the barrel. This confirms the Soviet suspicion. The A-10 is not a plane with a gun attached. It is a flying gun. But firepower was only half the equation. The fighter mafia knew that to use this gun, the pilot had to get close point-blank range. That meant flying directly into the teeth of the ZSU-234 Shilka and the Igla missiles. This led to the second innovation that baffled the Soviets, the titanium bathtub. In the Soviet investigations, they theorized about titanium armor. They were right, but they underestimated the implementation. The American engineers built a 1,200-pound tub of titanium that encloses the lower part of the cockpit. The pilot sits inside this tub. It is designed to stop 23mm high-explosive rounds and 37mm shells. It is a medieval concept applied to the jet age. While other planes relied on electronic jamming and flares to avoid getting hit, the A-10 assumed it would get hit. It was built to take a punch. This philosophy of redundancy is what caused the impossible return witnessed by the Iraqi radar operators. The engineers at Fairchild looked at every way a plane could die, and they designed a backup. If the hydraulic system is shot out, there is a backup hydraulic system. If that one is shot out, there is a third system, a mechanical one. This is the manual reversion that the Soviet translators thought was a mistranslation. The A-10 has actual steel cables running from the stick to the control surfaces. If all power is lost, the pilot can fly the jet using raw muscle power, wrestling the wind. It is crude, it is exhausting, but it works. They place the engines high on the tail, shielding them from the heat seekers on the ground, using the tail wings themselves. They designed the engines to run even if the fan blades were shredded by shrapnel. They built the wings with a honeycomb structure so that even if a large chunk was blown off, the remaining structure would hold. The Soviet military machine was built on the concept of the exchange ratio. They accepted that they would lose tanks and planes, but they had more of them. The American A-10 flipped this logic. It was a force multiplier. One A-10 could stay in the fight after taking damage that would ground an entire squadron of MiG-29 aircraft. But the most terrifying aspect of the A-10, the one that truly shocked the Soviet observers, was the pilot culture that this machine created. Because the plane was slow, because it was ugly, the Top Gun pilots didn't want to fly it. The pilots who ended up in the A-10 community were a different breed. They weren't interested in dogfights or high-altitude glory. They were obsessed with the mud. They trained to fly at 50 feet, dodging trees and power lines. They memorized the silhouette of every Soviet tank. While the Soviet Union was training its pilots to be rigidly controlled by ground radar stations, treating them like remote-controlled assets, the A-10 pilots were trained to be independent hunters. They were given a slow plane and a big gun and told to go find trouble. In 1991, the secret project from the 1970s was finally unleashed. The Soviets were looking for high-tech explanations, lasers, stealth, computer brains. They didn't realize they were facing a brute force solution to a high-tech problem. The Americans had brought a sledgehammer to a chess match. And as the ground war in Desert Storm intensified, the Soviets were about to get the reveal they had been dreading. The investigation was about to end, not with a report, but with a moment of clarity so shocking it would rewrite their military textbooks. Moscow. The Kremlin Archives. March 1991. The war in the desert is ending, but the shockwave is just hitting the Kremlin. The investigation that began with confused reports of ghosts and indestructible planes has culminated in a final, devastating briefing. The mystery is solved, and the answer is far worse than the Soviet generals feared. The shock moment arrives not with a bang, but with a heavy metallic thud on a wooden table. A GRU intelligence officer places a single object in front of the gathered marshals. It is an inert 30mm shell recovered from the sands of Kuwait. It is not a bullet. It is a monstrous slug, the size of a human forearm, encased in aluminum but hiding a dense, dark secret at its core. This is what is killing the tanks, the officer announces. It is depleted uranium. A murmur of disbelief ripples through the room. The Soviet chemists and physicists know the properties of depleted uranium. It is a byproduct of nuclear enrichment, incredibly dense and self-sharpening. When it hits armor at high velocity, it doesn't just mushroom like lead. It shears, stays sharp, and burns its way through steel like a plasma cutter. They are firing these. The officer pauses, consulting his notes, at a rate of 3,900 rounds per minute. The generals stare at the shell. They do the math. That is not a strafing run. That is a laser beam of heavy metal. The sewing machine mystery is solved. The A-10 aircraft doesn't need to hit a specific weak point on a T-72 tank. It doesn't need to find the engine vent. It simply washes the tank in a stream of uranium, and the kinetic energy alone liquefies the crew inside. The reveal deepens when the technical schematics of the A-10, finally fully appreciated by Soviet intelligence, are overlaid with the damage reports. The pilot sits here. The officer points to the nose section. Inside a titanium tub. We thought this was a figure of speech. It is literal. The Americans built a tank turret, put wings on it, and put a man inside. This is the moment the paradigm shifts. The Soviets realize they have been fighting the wrong war. They spent billions on the S-300 missile systems and the Tunguska anti-aircraft vehicles to track and kill high-flying, fragile jets. They built a defense network designed to catch a Ferrari. The Americans sent a bulldozer. The realization turns to horror as they review the transcripts of the impossible return. They finally understand why the plane didn't die. The reports show a 10 aircraft returning to base with half a wing missing, with one engine blown off, with the fuselage riddled with hundreds of holes. One specific photo, smuggled out of a US airbase, shows an A-10 Warthog sitting on the tarmac. It looks like a sieve. The tail is shredded. The hydraulics are gone. The pilot is climbing out, unharmed, patting the side of the jet. It is not that they are invisible, General Yazov whispers, realizing the strategic nightmare. It is that they simply do not care if we shoot them. This is the insane bravery that shocked the generals. The American pilots knew they were flying into a meat grinder. They knew the radar was lighting them up. But they trusted the titanium bathtub and the redundancy of their machine so implicitly that they flew into the fire, not away from it. Desperate to save face and to save their Iraqi allies who were being slaughtered, the Soviet advisors in Baghdad had attempted one final, futile countermeasure. They had advised the Iraqi Air Force to deploy their interceptors. Use the MiG-25 aircraft, the Soviets urged. Use the MiG-29 aircraft. The A-10 is slow. It is a sitting duck for a supersonic fighter. On paper, this made sense. A MiG-25 Foxbat can fly at Mach 3. An A-10 flies at 300 knots. It should be a slaughter. But the reality of the futile response was a humiliation. The reports detail an engagement where an Iraqi MiG-25 aircraft tried to hunt a flight of 8 seconds. The MiG-25 roared in at high speed, its radar searching the sky. But the 8 seconds weren't in the sky. They were down in the weeds, flying 50 feet off the hard desert floor. The MiG-25's radar, designed to look up at bombers or straight ahead at fighters, was useless. The ground clutter, the return signals from the Earth itself, blinded the sensors. The attenseconds were invisible, not because of stealth technology, but because they were hiding in the dirt. The MiG-25 pilot, moving at supersonic speeds, couldn't slow down enough to engage. He zoomed past, turning a wide circle that took miles to complete. By the time he turned back, the 8 seconds had vanished into a wadi or turned tightly inside his radius. It was a hawk, trying to catch a rat in a burrow. The speed difference, which the Soviets thought was their advantage, became their undoing. The A-10 was too slow to be killed. And then, the ultimate insult occurred. In one rare instance of air-to-air combat, an A-10, the slow, ugly bomber, actually shot down a helicopter. The predator became the prey. The Soviet doctrine of air superiority, through speed, collapsed. The shock moment in the Kremlin is total. The generals realize that the Americans have mastered a domain of war that the Soviets neglected, the psychological terror of the low and slow attack. The T-72 tank is dead, a tank commander states, his voice flat. If this aircraft exists, armor is obsolete. It is a hyperbolic statement, but in the heat of the moment it feels true. The A-10 didn't just destroy tanks, it destroyed the concept of the tank column. No Soviet general could ever again confidently order a mass-armored advance without asking, where are the warthogs? The mystery of the ghost in the desert is solved. It wasn't a ghost. It was a flying gun, piloted by men who flew with a reckless disregard for death, protected by a titanium shield that Russian engineers had deemed too heavy to be practical. The investigation is closed. The result is a catastrophe for Soviet military exports. Who would buy a T-72 tank now, knowing it can be opened like a tin can by a plane that the US Air Force wanted to retire? But the impact goes deeper than just tank sales. As the smoke clears over the highway of death, the Soviet leadership is forced to confront a macroeconomic reality that spells the end of their empire. The A-10 was not just a victory of engineering, it was a victory of a system that encouraged innovation, redundancy, and individual pilot initiative over rigid central control. Moscow. The Ministry of Defense, August 1991. The desert heat has faded from the headlines, but in the chilled corridors of Soviet power, the freeze is setting in. The Soviet Union is only months away from its total collapse. While political unrest and economic stagnation are the visible cracks in the foundation, the military report on the A-10 Warthog acts as a silent, structural failure deep within the empire's psyche. The final assessment of the Gulf War air campaign has landed on the desks of the General Staff. It contains the verdict, a set of statistics so lopsided they look like errors. The Soviet doctrine relied on the concept of acceptable losses. They assumed that in a clash with NATO, for every 10 tanks they lost, they would take out 1 or 2 enemy aircraft. They believed the exchange rate would eventually favor their superior numbers. The report destroys this assumption. During the conflict, the A-10 fleet, the obsolete aircraft, the slow target, conducted over 8,000 sorties. They fired over 780,000 rounds of 30mm depleted uranium ammunition. The result? They destroyed 987 tanks. They destroyed nearly 1,200 artillery pieces. They obliterated over 2,000 other military vehicles. And the cost? The Americans lost only 6 A-10 aircraft to enemy fire. The generals stare at the numbers. The ratio is not 10-1. It is nearly 165-1. For every Warthog brought down, an entire armored regiment was wiped off the map. This is the killer statistic that signals the end of an era. The T-72 tank, a machine that cost millions of rubles to build, crew, and maintain, was being dismantled by a 3-second burst of cannon fire that cost less than a standard civilian car. The economic asymmetry is devastating. The Soviets realize they cannot win an economic war against an enemy that can destroy their most expensive assets with such cheap, brutal efficiency. The shock of the A-10 goes beyond the battlefield stats. It forces a painful introspection regarding the entire Soviet military-industrial complex. For decades, the Soviets chased the Americans in the high-tech race. When the Americans built the B-1 bomber, the Soviets built the Tu-160 bomber. When the Americans built the F-15 aircraft, the Soviets built the Su-27 aircraft. They were obsessed with parity in speed, altitude, and electronics. They were obsessed with looking advanced. But the A-10 proved that the Americans possessed something the Soviets lacked, the capacity for specialized, divergent thinking. The Soviet system was rigid. A top-down hierarchy decided what weapons were needed. If the General Secretary liked fast planes, everyone built fast planes. There was no room for a fighter mafia or a group of rebels to push through an ugly, slow, specialized aircraft like the Warthog. In the Soviet system, the A-10 would have been cancelled at the drawing board for being regressive. The American system, chaotic and competitive, allowed a mistake like the A-10 to survive because it worked. The Soviets realized they had been beaten not by a microchip, but by a philosophy. They had been beaten by the American willingness to build a machine that was ugly, unglamorous, and strictly utilitarian. This realization creates a crisis of confidence in the Kremlin. Their client states Syria, Libya, North Korea watched the same footage. They saw the burning T-72 tanks. They saw the Iraqi army, modeled entirely on Soviet doctrine, surrendering to drones and helicopters. The phone lines to the Soviet arms export agency, Rosoboronexport, went silent. Who would buy a Soviet tank now? The A-10 had single-handedly devalued the Soviet Union's primary export. The impact of the A-10 extended into the psychology of the common soldier. In the interrogation rooms of Saudi Arabia, Iraqi prisoners of war conscripts and Republican Guard alike spoke of the aircraft with a reverence reserved for natural disasters. They didn't fear the high-flying F-16 aircraft. Those bombs fell silently. It was a lottery of death. If you died, you never knew it. But the A-10 was personal. The soldiers described the sound, the burr. Because the bullets travel faster than sound, the target dies before they hear the gun. If you hear the noise, it means you are alive, but it also means the plane is circling back. This psychological terror, the whispering death, broke the will of the Iraqi army faster than hunger or thirst. Soviet observers noted this carefully. They realized that the Americans had reintroduced fear into the sterile equation of modern warfare. They hadn't just built a weapon, they had built a monster. In the years following 1991, as the Russian Federation emerged from the ashes of the USSR, the lessons of the A-10 forced a radical redesign of their armor. The modern Russian T-90 tanks and the T-14 Armata tanks are now covered in reactive armor and active protection systems, desperate attempts to stop the kind of kinetic penetrators the Prots, A-10 fires. They spent the next 30 years trying to armor their tanks against a plane that was designed in 1972. The Cold War is over. The Berlin Wall is dust. The Soviet Union is a memory. The T-72 tanks that once threatened to roll across the Fulda Gap are now rusting in scrapyards or burning in new wars. But the A-10 Thunderbolt II remains. The US Air Force has tried to retire it half a dozen times since Desert Storm. They call it too old. They call it too slow. They say it cannot survive in a world of hypersonic missiles and laser weapons. They want to replace it with the sleek, invisible F-35 aircraft. But every time a war starts in Afghanistan, in Iraq again, in Syria, the soldiers on the ground make the call. They don't ask for the invisible jet that flies at 40,000 feet. They ask for the Hog. They ask for the ugly machine that flies in the mud. They ask for the titanium bathtub. They ask for the gun. The mystery that baffled the Soviet generals in 1991 has become a legend.
And that was the Cold War. Back in a minute. Thank you. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States today, bidding adios to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there, and reminding you that you're not neutral and that the government has no rights.